Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We're champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Lu Ngo, coming to your ears from Narm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Sero Boost. Let's talk about the happiness science here. And today we are going to learn a bit more about the other side of happiness, which is unhappiness. As much as we would like to learn about how to manage our happiness, we also need to know what to do when unhappiness happens and what we can do to avoid unhappiness as much as possible. And today's topic is rumination's role in unhappiness. And our guest today actually has been on one of our LMSL's podcasts before. And last time she was on the wellbeing show. So I'm really glad to have her back. It's my joy to host both shows and to be able to interview a guest for a second time. So welcome back to the show, Loretta. And for our audience members who have not listened to the previous conversation that Loretta was in, we're going to make sure to link that in the show notes. And I would like to introduce her again, just in case you don't know who she is. Loretta Breuning is founder of the Inner Mammal Institute, which helps people manage the ups and downs of their mammal brain. As Professor Emerita of Management at California State University, East Bay, and as a mom, she was not convinced by prevailing theories of human motivation. She learned that our happy brain chemicals swing up and down because they have a job to do. When you know what they do in animals, you can make peace with your inner mammal. You can wire yourself to enjoy more happy chemicals and relieve more unhappy chemicals. Find out how at innermammalinstitute.org. Breuning is the author of 8 books, including Habits of a Happy Brain, Retrain Your Brain to Boost Your Serotonin, Dopamine, Oxytocin, and Endorphins levels, and Tame Your Anxiety, Rewiring Your Brain for Happiness. Thanks so much for joining us again, Loretta. Welcome back.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, well, I am just so grateful because, as I said, I haven't got to interview a guest for a second time on this show yet. I think this is my first time on our LMSL podcast because we have such a wide range of topics. And I think last time we had a really interesting conversation on teamwork. We talked a lot about animals because I think we used a lot of references, and you were helping us to relate how the teamwork that we as humans do. We can sort of think about that and learn from how animals behave. And today we're talking about something completely different, which is rumination. But I guess you could probably relate that back to animals somehow. So I'm going to be very excited to find out more about it. So for our audience member who has tuned into our podcast for the first time, or who has, been here before but have not heard from you yet, what would be your story, and what can you share a bit more with us about your professional background? Because you've written so many books on so many different topics. I'm curious, how did you get here, and why did you choose to do the work that you're doing?
Sure. So I've had a lot of careers in my lifetime, and I was a professor of management for 25 years. I took early retirement because I didn't really love it. And that's when I had free time to explore things that helped me understand the world. And the world I lived in was each of us, we are wired when we're young. So whatever was going on when you were young is sort of like the lens through which you see the world. When I was young, there was a lot of unhappiness around me, and I always struggled to understand it. And then when I discovered academic psychology, I thought, oh, well, this has to be the solution. I'll just follow the studies and then everything will be easy. But of course, as you could imagine, that life was not so easy and not instant happiness all the time. So then once I retired, I was able to read more and more research and find out the deeper source of unhappiness in the animal brain that we've inherited that we have underneath the big human part of the brain.
Fascinating. Well, thank you for sharing. And what an interesting career you've had so far. And I'm sure, there's still more to come. It seems to me like you continuously learn new things and continuously research this new topic. And I think that's just a fun bit, right? And I think today we're going to learn even more about rumination in this context, because that's what we're here to talk about. I'm excited. Now, last time you were here, we've already done Have You Met Loretta? But this time we're going to do it again. And I'm pretty sure this time you're going to give us new answers because, there are so many things that we love as humans. I'm sure you have other things you can share with us on this show compared to the well-being show last time. So first of all, what would be your recent favorite book?
My recent favorite book. Okay. I just had the most amazing experience of I read biographies mostly, and I happened to be reading a biography of a guy in India who started out in a small, poor village and eventually created a whole chain of luxury hotels. And then I ended up staying in one of the hotels he created, which was really a coincidence. So that was very exciting for me. But it was really fascinating for me to read, like step by step by step, how did he do it? And then, frankly, I got in the hotel like a little bit of the gossip of the people who had worked with him and his son and their side of the story.
Oh, that is fascinating. What is the book called?
Oh, Dare to Dream, A Life of M.S. Oberoi.
Ooh, very interesting. Well, thank you for sharing. And how fun. You've actually stayed in one of his hotels.
Yeah. In
Definitely
Mumbai.
fun. Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's going to be a whole different experience when you read the story and the biography. So thank you for sharing that. So, what would be your recent favorite movie?
I've watched all of the movies about the pharmaceutical industry and things that have gone wrong, and a lot of them are dramatizations, but they are interesting. One was called Painkillers, one was called Pain Hustlers, and I had already read the books that these movies are based on. So I know that they can be a little sensationalized, but it's really great for people to understand behind the scenes as they are getting tempted to take medications.
Mm. Yeah, that sounds interesting. I think I saw it on Netflix, the Painkillers one, especially. I've been meaning to watch it, but I haven't. Yeah, okay. Sounds good. Definitely will make a note to myself to watch it soon. Now, I don't know if you're a podcast listener. I can't remember what you said last time. If you are a podcast listener, what would be your recent favorite show?
Oh, I love How I Built This. So I listen to that a lot.
What is the podcast about?
Oh, it's interviews with entrepreneurs that build companies that are famous. And it's modern companies and young founders. So a lot of the people are like when you go to a store and you see a new brand of something and you never thought about, I wonder who created this. And you
Yeah.
get the whole inside story. And then you find out how really hard it is to do anything and how all these people have failed so many times before they succeed.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's going to be really inspirational to listen to. So, thank you for the recommendation. I personally love listening to those stories. So, we'll definitely check that out. Now, I wonder if you have one role model in life or maybe several role models in life. And if so, who are they?
Huh. Oh, good question. I don't have any role models now, but I think when I was young, I really did trust my teachers and liked, well, I mean, they were my role models. And I think when I got to the end of college, I didn't have any ideas of what to do except become a teacher because it's like the only thing I had ever been exposed to. So then I went to grad school and then I became a college professor.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you. I think we had a chat with another guest earlier today, and she was kind of saying very similar things. Where her role models were her professors in her undergrad, and that has influenced her to choose the career path that she chose. And I think that's kind of like what a lot of us go through, and especially when we have great teachers, right? They inspire us. So very glad to hear that you had wonderful teachers earlier in life. And finally, speaking of teaching, learning, and all that fun stuff, I wonder if there has been a course that you took, probably. Maybe recently or maybe a long time ago, that has really inspired you in your life.
Once I retired, I took adult education courses in like Adobe Illustrator, and Adobe Photoshop was like way over my head, really hard. But then they gave free classes in the Apple Store in like 15 years ago. Isn't that like amazing? And I mean, even until recently. And I learned so much from them. Like my whole life, I wished I could make some kind of, graphic. And then I could do it like in 5 minutes. And I didn't, normally it would take you an hour to even explain to someone else how to do it, not to mention the cost. And so I was so thrilled to learn to do a little bit of graphics myself.
Yeah. Oh, that's really cool. I didn't know you could do graphics too. So that must be fun to play around with. Thank you for sharing that. And I think, if I'm not wrong, then your set of answers this time is a little bit different from last time, which is fun because we get to know, different aspects of you. So that's great. Okay, now that we've got to know Loretta a bit better, let's talk about today's topic. Today, you're here to talk about rumination's role in unhappiness. And to understand that, let's put things into context. Last time you talked about well-being. This time, let's talk about happiness. What do you think happiness means? And, what is your personal view on happiness as a concept?
Well, my personal view after the research that I did is that it's these 4 specific chemicals that create good feelings, because that's the job of those chemicals. Now, no one thinks this. We all look for philosophical explanations of happiness with our verbal brain, because our verbal brain is not aware of our animal brain. So what I discovered was that these chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, and endorphin, people have heard of them. They create good feelings. But what amazed me was that animals have the same chemicals, and animals don't philosophize. Animals release these good chemicals in very specific situations, and animals do it with brain structures that we have underneath our human cortex. And because animals can't talk, your animal brain can't tell you why it's releasing one of these chemicals. And that's why our verbal brain invents these philosophical explanations for happiness to try to make sense of, like, why did this good feeling turn on? And then more important, why did it turn off? And that's what really motivated me, is like, the chemicals turn off because they're supposed to. And I was so amazed to learn that. And that's really what keeps me going.
Yeah, that's definitely a really good perspective, because I think on this show we've talked about those chemicals before, not necessarily at the same time though. So I think it is good to understand it, because I guess for some of our experts, they do mention the fact that, like there are all these like different definitions of happiness based on psychology, or, like different fields of studies. And when you mentioned the fact that, there are these 4 chemicals, they release feel-good hormones, and, they ask your happiness, it sounds to me like we just need to understand how and when these chemicals are released in our brains. And, with that understanding, we can boost our level of happiness, by doing activities that would allow us to let this chemicals come to life in our brain. Anyways, that's the fun bit. And it sounds a little bit like you're studying physics, but not really. It's a different.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And many people think it's sort of reductionist and crass to think it's just chemicals. But when you hear what triggers the chemicals in animals, you could see that this is what we're always pushing ourselves to do, because our brain rewards it with happy chemicals. And we probably don't have the time to explain it now, but all of my books explain it. And also my website explains it at no cost.
Ooh, beautiful. We'll definitely link your website in the show note for the audience. I think we already mentioned that briefly in your bio earlier. It's the Inner Mammal Institute.org, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that. Now, given that you've studied these chemicals, you've sort of get to know how happiness works in both animals and humans, I guess, what would be some of your observations when it comes to misconceptions about happiness? Because as you said, a lot of people don't think about happiness this way.
Yeah. So the biggest problem is when people chase an ecstatic state. Often teenagers get the idea that there should be some like great high, and then they want to keep that high state all the time, which is so unreasonable in our expectations. But of course, it feels good. So we think, oh, wouldn't it be great if I could feel that way all the time? So that's why it's so important to understand why that feeling is not meant to be on all the time. Other people are not getting it all the time. And when you chase it, you often do more harm than good.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because I'm not an expert in this area, but I do remember reading something about the fact that when you are, let's say, you're stressed, you want to, let's say, binge watch a TV series or like binge eat something like ice cream or a fried food. A lot of people turn to that, and that releases dopamine, if I'm not wrong. And you just keep doing that over and over again because you know that that's the only thing that you know that would feel good. So in that sense, even though we were saying that understand these chemicals would help us, it's not just about doing what's going to release these chemicals and make us feel good, but also pick and choose the right thing that would actually create the good kinds of chemicals and the chemicals that would allow us to feel lasting happiness and be able to manage our lives rather than just chasing that high all the time, like you were saying.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And one thing it's important to talk about, and we'll probably get more into this with rumination, but I call it distraction. It's distraction in the positive sense that if you're feeling bad about something and then you think, oh, I'll order a pizza or I'll watch a movie, that distracts you from the negative thought. And that really relieves the negative thought. And so once you know that, then you don't really need the pizza or the movie because you know that any activity would release the negative thoughts. So no sense ruining your health, but find other activities.
I think that's actually the toughest thing to navigate, right? Because we know, I think we all know this by now. And most of the people that are tuning into this show, they're probably conscious about the fact that they need to rewire their brains. I think that's one of the key words in one of your books, in a way that would help them to do activities that actually add to their overall health, well-being, and their level of happiness. But it's challenging. And that is probably because of that rumination, right? Because sometimes we just get stuck in that loop of rumination and we cannot get out of it. So let's learn a bit more about rumination. That's what we're here to talk about. So Loretta, how would you define rumination, especially in the context of the brain chemicals and, the things that would add or, take away from our happiness?
So the human brain is wired by experience. So whatever turned on your happy chemicals in your past created neural pathways that turn them on more easily today. Whatever turned on your bad feeling chemicals created neural pathways that turn that on more easily today. So we all sort of repeat ourselves and get stuck in the same thoughts because they're real physical pathways in the brain. When you have a negative thought, your brain is doing it for a positive reason, which is something like, how can I prevent it from happening again? Or, this is so unfair. It's not my fault. It's your fault. So we're always trying to take something negative and find a positive way of looking at it. But we don't take in new information. We just repeat the same thought over and over because it's a real physical pathway. And the electricity in your brain flows to the biggest pathways you have. And you're not consciously deciding that. So it just happens without conscious intent. But once you know that the brain works that way, then you can say, oh, I created that thought. And instead of thinking somebody else is forcing you to feel that way.
Mm. I think, yeah, that's such a great point. And for a lot of us, it's a new thing that we are learning, especially when we learn about ourselves. I guess we probably don't even catch it when rumination happens, right? And so I think there's so many questions that I have in my mind right now, but let's focus on the topic. So how would rumination actually affect our happiness? Because we know that it's going to create unhappiness. But in simple terms for our audience, how would it actually affect our level of happiness?
So you could say that it limits your options because when you're ruminating on one option, you think, oh, my life would be fine if it weren't for this. But really, maybe there's 10 other solutions, 10 other ways to move forward, and you're ignoring them because you're focused on this one. And again, it's so useful to know that it's just because the electricity in your brain finds the biggest pathways, just like water in a storm. It flows into the pathways that grew big from your past. And every time you repeat a thought, you make the pathway bigger. So you could actually find a way to ruminate on something more positive, but in the beginning, you don't do that because the pathway is small. So it's good to know that if you repeat this positive thought, then that will become a bigger pathway.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like if we can ruminate on something positive, that would also work if we were to rewire how we look at rumination.
Yes. However, within limits, we have to be realistic because you could imagine if a young person says, I'm going to be, excuse me, I'm going to be a rock star. And then they just think that over and over. And let's say maybe they don't have good life habits otherwise. And whenever things go badly, they say, that's okay because I'm going to be a rock star.
Yeah, it's kind of
So
like,
that would
yeah,
not be a very helpful form of
yeah,
rumination. So it
yeah.
needs to be realistic. It needs to be open to new information rather than just repeatedly using the same pathway in your brain.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's kind of like how nuanced it could be, especially when you look at it from the perspective of, well, this could be something so good. I'm eventually gonna have it. It has to happen, even though you're doing nothing to make it happen. It's kind of like you're in denial in a way, right? So that's not that beneficial for your happiness. So we've talked about brain chemicals when we started the conversation, right? That's like right off the bat, the first thing that you mentioned. So we know that these chemicals are released in our brains. Like that's what you just taught us. And also we've got the survival behaviors, and this is what we learned from animal behaviors. So how would rumination align with or deviate from this? Because I think you study animals at length and in depth. You would probably have some insights into this.
Sure. So I'll give you two examples. Animals, of course, they don't ruminate with verbal thoughts, like a person might put it into words, but they do have repetitive thoughts because it promotes survival both on the good side and the bad side. The bad side is, of course, animals have predators and they think, oh, I can't go there because I might get eaten by a predator. I can't go wandering out alone because I might get eaten by a wolf. And in the human world, we say, oh, ignore your fears and just overcome your fears. But an animal who ignored their fear of a predator would just get eaten alive, and then their genes would not be passed on. So we inherited our brains from individuals who honored their fears when they had some basis. Now, on the good side, let's say if you have a squirrel and it's looking for food for the winter, and then it looks for more food, and then it looks for more food. It keeps looking for food. So animals are always looking for food. So humans may say, oh, we shouldn't worry. We should take it easy. We worry too much about earning money or whatever. We should just take it easy. But the animal brain doesn't do that. They're always worried about not having enough and finding more.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example because in some ways, it's also our survival instinct, isn't it? Like when we think about what we frequently discuss with other people, and the thoughts that normally run in our heads, it's exactly that. Like, what do I do to survive? And then how do I thrive in life? And I think all of those things, obviously, it's a little different from animals, but it's the same sort of pathways that you were talking about. And another thing that I thought about when you mentioned that is anxiety, because I think a lot of the times we are anxious about the future. Like, what might happen? Like, will this make my life miserable? Or will I not be able to continue on with certain things in life? And there seems to be a dead end, but like you're saying, there's so many different pathways in life, and you don't necessarily have to ruminate over one thing. But anxiety just is like this beast, I would say. I read a book on the topic of anxiety a while ago, and the author called anxiety a beast that we have to kind of understand and defeat, and understand how beautiful it is to defeat it. Anyway, coming back to rumination and anxiety, when we were talking and discussing the podcast before we started, you mentioned that anxiety is a topic that is quite closely related to rumination. So for people that are sort of starting to know about anxiety or started to deal with anxiety, and I know this firsthand from a lot of my friends who said, I actually never had anxiety before so and so, and then now they have maybe a new job or a new situation in life, or new relationships, and that cause anxiety. That tends to lead to rumination, and they tend to think about that quite a bit. So how would you say this relationship between rumination and anxiety can play out in real life? And it can, maybe the relationship here can inhibit our happiness. It can cause more unhappiness. I'm not sure how it works with the brain chemicals, but I think that there's a really close relationship here.
Sure. So our brain is designed to look for information relevant to rewards and threats. Reward is anything that meets your needs, like an animal looks for food and water. And a threat is anything that can hurt you or anything that can prevent you from getting food. Like, let's say if you see food, but then you see that there's a river and you have to cross the river to get to the food, So we are constantly looking around for rewards and threats. The minute in the modern world, it's so easy to get food and water that we have all this extra energy to look for threats. Now, in the modern world, we don't have predators. We're not going to starve to death, or we have enough firewood. So we're not in immediate danger. So our brain keeps looking for danger further away. There's no danger here. Let me look further, further, further. You look further away in time and in space. So the minute you have something good in your life, you worry about losing it. You worry about what could go wrong in the future or what's going wrong on the other side of the world. So our brain is just designed to look for information relevant to our own survival. And even when we're safe, it just keeps looking for information. So that's how it happens. And we believe the information that we find. So the more you know that this is just something your brain does, you can then tell yourself, oh, it's not a real emergency. I just made it into an emergency because there was no bigger emergency.
Right. That is very interesting. I think this is going to get a lot of people to start thinking about their anxiety, because I think in the modern world, I have to say, upon reading on this topic, I find that it's a prevalent thing nowadays, but not so much in the past. Obviously, anxiety has always been a thing, but right now in our modern world, so many more people are struggling with anxiety. And
well, what is not mentioned in the news coverage that you read is what I call diseasification of anxiety. So the idea that it is now considered a diagnosable, illness, disorder, whereas in the past, people just said, I'm upset. So the question is, do we benefit from making it a disease? And this is the topic of my latest book that was just released last week. It's called Why You're Unhappy, Biology versus Politics. And I go into the politics of how is it that this was created to be a disease, which is a real legal thing, especially in the United States. It has a legal status of whenever you get a diagnosis, and there are certain benefits to getting a diagnosis. So people have been trained to perceive their own emotions as a disorder and to get a diagnosis so that they can unleash those benefits. And nobody says that because, as I explain in my new book, threatens your career. I can say it because I'm retired, but there are a lot of career threats if you say it.
I see. I see. Yeah, I think it's definitely a new thing in the space of psychology and and healthcare as well. I don't know much about this yet. I just started reading on this. Probably for the past 2 years. I've been reading on this about this a bit more, and I think it's such an interesting topic to navigate because we're talking about the topic of rumination and anxiety, and in my brain it is quite simple. Like you start to think about something that might happen. It's basically in the future. And then you just keep ruminating on that. Speaking of rumination, and that causes more anxiety. So it's kind of this vicious circle, and you just cannot break away from it because you don't think about anything else. And so, actually, like you were saying before, right, thinking about different things that can actually happen, different scenarios that can play out, that really helps. And I'm sure there would be other strategies we can do to rewire this. So, speaking of rumination, this conversation is not about anxiety per se, but we're talking about rumination, which, if we understand, could also help us to deal with anxiety, whether it be diagnosed or not diagnosed, right? So, for our audience who are wondering, okay, I understand rumination and I understand what it is and all these brain chemicals. How do I rewire it? How do I rewire my brain so that I don't ruminate as much?
So it's amazing to know that we have a lot of neuroplasticity when we're young, and then we have much less in adulthood. And as a result, whatever neural pathways you built when you were young, that is shaping the rumination that you have in adulthood. And people don't really like to think this. It feels like a weakness. But it's important to know that everyone is in the same situation because the brain is just built when we're young. That's when we have a lot of myelin, which is like the paving on your neural pathways. So when you find yourself ruminating about something, look for a pattern in your childhood that fits the same thing you're thinking about now. And it's so fascinating to see this in other people too, so you're not so defensive about seeing it yourself. Once you realize that your rumination is just a pathway that you built in childhood, then you could say, well, I can build a new pathway so that I don't just slide into the same thought pattern. I could build a different way of thinking about it. But again, it takes a lot of repetition because our neuroplasticity is not nearly as high in adulthood.
Yeah, I think that's definitely some good information for our audience to digest because some people might think, oh, like I'm just ruminating over this one thing and I don't think I can ever get over it. Actually, maybe you can, knowing the science behind it, right? So I think another thing is when we talked about rumination earlier, with the current modern society that we have, right? Let's just say in reality right now, a lot of people are having anxiety or rumination because they compare themselves to others, or just because of the things that are happening in the world. And I think you mentioned the word politics earlier, right? I think that's such a big factor nowadays because there's just so much information fed to us from different sources, and that causes us to ruminate over something that is we probably wouldn't think about if it hadn't been for all these sources of information. So when that is the case, what can we do to manage, our brain, like our brain chemicals, let's say, because in terms of rewiring, you already mentioned a few things we can do, but to manage this, especially with all the influences we're getting, what can we do?
So the first thing is to know that you get to control what you feed your brain. So imagine like people who, before they go to bed at night, they watch some terrible news that's very upsetting, and then they can't sleep. So you are not benefiting yourself by feeding yourself on negativity, whether it comes from a recorded channel or from people in your life. You can choose what gets access to your brain. And it takes a real lot of effort to only expose your brain to positive things. It really does. You have to really shop very hard to find positive things to expose your brain to. And so we can all do it, and we can all observe how we're creating the bad feelings. And it's hard to do because everyone around you may be listening to the news or watching that depressing movie, but they're feeling the effects and you're feeling the effects. So you have to take charge for your own brain.
Yeah, I think that's good advice, and especially because this is some funny things that I've mentioned on the show before. I actually don't watch the news and I don't read the news as often as other people, and in a way, it's kind of like ignorance is bliss because I don't know about a lot of things that are happening, which according to the modern world I should know about. But then I would have conversation with friends, right? And then sometimes they would slip into the conversation. Oh, have you heard so and so died? Or like, have you heard so and so is happening, and it's going to affect our like living expenses or whatever. And I'm like, oh, really? I didn't know that. And then I started to worry about it when previously I didn't have that information. Everything was fine. And, maybe when it happens, I'll deal with it. But now I'm thinking about something that hasn't happened yet, or, thinking about something and ruminating over something that is not the information that I was actively looking for. So I think what you were saying earlier is, like what kind of contents we're feeding ourselves, but also kind of like the conversations and the people we surround ourselves with would also be very important. Because imagine you've got two people that are both ruminating on different things and they just have this way of thinking that are quite similar. And so they come together, they talk, and then at the end of the conversation, they ruminate over what they were talking about even more. So I guess that's also another factor. What would you say?
Yes, definitely. And I'm just thinking it's so funny that a lot of podcasters tell me that they don't listen to the news. And it seems like maybe podcasters are people who have like decided to take charge and like be the news rather than being like a passive recipient of it. But yeah, on a deeper level, there's like this alarmism, like people bond around negativity and animals bond around negativity. When there's a predator, all of the animals stick together. When there's no predator, the animals spread out. So people are always focused on threats because that's what makes them feel united. And it's nice to feel united, but not if you're united in bad feelings. It's like, oh, we all feel so bad about this. We all feel so bad about that, but you just end up feeling bad all the time.
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the hardest things to manage because, sometimes, and this is what's happening in the world right now, there's a war going on and a lot of people are bonding over that. They come together, they go and they protest. And I think that's, a wonderful thing they are doing for the community. So for that, I guess it's not all bad, but it's the level of engagement and also what it is that you're focusing on. Like, is it going to help others? Is it going to help yourselves? I think that's the question that we probably have to ask ourselves, because same thing with rumination. I realize that when something is a big problem in your life and you're ruminating over it, in order to try and find a solution and actually work on the solution, that's actually not that bad of a thing. But when you let it take over and all you do is ruminate over it and let it control your life and you cannot do anything else, then that's when it's really harming you. For example, like I could be feeling really bad about how out of shape I am. And I was like, okay, I've been thinking about this for a while. Let me just go to the gym. Let me just sign up. That is probably a positive outcome that, that happens. But if I'm ruminating, same thing. I'm like, oh, I'm just so out of shape. I'm so sad. And then I eat some more pizza and then I eat some more ice cream to kind of manage that and ruminate some more. Because, after I eat the pizza and the ice cream, I feel even worse about my body shape, and then, how healthy I am. I guess there are two ways to go about it too. So it's not necessarily a thing that is all bad, as long as we have that lens of, okay, how am I going to look at this situation? Am I ruminating to find a solution, or am I ruminating just to get stuck there?
Yeah, so the simple thing is to focus on things you have control over and not focus on things you don't have control over. So a simple example is when people think, oh, I would be so happy if this other person would change. So you don't have control over that person. And then you think, oh, so there's nothing I can do because all my problems are caused by them. So if you have that mindset, then you're going to be miserable. And it's the same with watching the news. If you think, I would be so happy if it weren't for this political event or whatever. So bottom line is, if you focus on your next step, that's what triggers your happy chemicals. Animals are always focused on their next step. and their happy chemicals reward them for stepping toward meeting their needs. And when you focus on your next step toward meeting your needs, that will stimulate your happy chemicals.
Yeah, that's such a great idea. And speaking of which, you sort of touched on something really practical there. So let's go into our practice section to get even more practical for our audience. So let's say someone's listening to this conversation, they kind of go, okay, I understand rumination, I understand the different brain chemicals. I need to work on it and manage it so that I actually feel happier and manage my rumination so that it doesn't take over my life. And you said that one of the things that we can do is to focus on the next step, just the one next step. That's good in theory. So in practice, if someone is saying, you know what, I'm still ruminating over so and so, whatever that might be, and I cannot seem to get out of it right now, and they've got a lot going on in their lives and they're kind of overwhelmed, what would be a practice you would recommend to them so that they can manage that rumination?
I think it's very individual because your next step is only satisfying. Okay, I'll start over. Okay. I think it's very individual because your happy chemicals are only triggered if you feel like you're stepping toward meeting your needs. So it's very individual. What step will get me toward meeting that need that is on my mind? So I don't believe in these sort of universal prescriptions for people. I think that your brain is very focused on the unmet need. So as soon as you meet one need, your brain focuses on the next unmet need, and it's that will stimulate your happy chemicals. The famous example of that is the person who is planning a wedding and like all of their energy is focused on that wedding. And like the week after the wedding, they're depressed because they don't have like a next goal. So that's what our brain is designed to focus on. And when we understand that, then we can manage it. And I'm not saying that we should always be trying to be hero of the universe and conquer the world. We can have realistic goals, but we have to be focused on a goal.
Yeah, I think that's actually really great advice because when you think about it, we tend to ruminate over something when we have nothing else to think about. That's exactly one of the points you were mentioning earlier, right? So I think even just setting a small goal helps. Because I remember there was a time when I was also ruminating over something. I cannot remember what it is now. It's been a while. And just setting a goal of, I'm going to wake up. I don't remember, but it was actually really bad. And I remember I set a goal to wake up every day at 5 and to read for an hour. That was just like a very simple goal, like nothing else. I don't need to achieve anything. Any books would do, as long as I keep reading. And I just woke up every day at 5 a.m. and read for an hour and then got started with my day with my coffee. And just that one small thing slowly helped me to get out of that, vicious circle of ruminating over whatever it was that I was thinking about.
That's fabulous. Yes, because it exposes you to a much larger world. So you don't just keep feeling like these frustrations that you have are the whole world. Because again, your brain is wired by your own experience. So if you don't expose it to a wider range of experiences, it will just repeat.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is going to apply to so many people in different scenarios, right? Whatever it is, because most of the time we're just getting stuck in our head and we don't spend time doing anything at all. We're just probably sitting there scrolling social media, thinking about it. So that's because we're passively receiving information, not really actively doing something. So I think setting a small goal of doing something small for yourself could be anything and just really stick with it. Maybe an activity, right? That would definitely help to slowly get us out of that loop. So yeah, I think that's a really great point you raised there. And now I've got inspiration to set new goals because also this is January when we're recording this, beginning of a new year. Lots of people set goals, so I think this is going to help in that context too. So yeah, thank you for coming on and sharing this. And I know you've been a bit unwell yourself, but it has been a really nice conversation, just getting to know more about the topic. And before we let you go, we've got open mic, as I mentioned earlier. This is your open platform to talk about anything you would like to share with our audience. So the floor is all yours.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to invite everyone. I have a free 5-day Happy Chemical Jumpstart on my website. So you get 1 email a day for 5 days, and it explains how the chemicals work and how you can rewire them. And you just put your email in the form at the bottom of any page of my website, innermammalinstitute.org. It also has information about all of my books, and I have lots of videos, podcasts, blogs, infographics, everything that you like to consume in any form.
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so much for sharing. I was going to ask you where we could find out more about your work and other things, but you already covered it. So we're good. And again, thank you so much for joining our LMSL podcast again, on another show. It has been a true joy talking to you. And just every time I talk to you, I learn so much about, human behaviors and how that's reflective of the animals' behaviors. So, it's just so fun. And now that I think about it, I keep thinking about my cats, it's just such a fun exercise to think about. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on today and for sharing all this information.
And by the way, speaking of, if you ever have a chance to be in an animal training class, it's so valuable, because when you see how animals are trained and you can train your own brain that way, you'd say, that's how it works. And I've even been to some dolphin training classes because it's just so amazing that it works.
Yeah, that sounds great. Sounds fun. Thank you so much. I'm going to try that. You have been listening to Sero Boost, the Happiness Science Insights podcast produced by the Happiness Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website, ha.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Lu Ngo. Thanks for tuning in.